The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Carl Jung. Welcome to part 2 of the investigation into society's crumbling capacity for redemption and its causes. There was once a terrible event which shook a community to its core. The event in question occurred in the late 17th century in the small town of Salem. In this society there was a strict moral code and a strong religious influence. Certain behaviors, thoughts, and desires that went against these religious and social norms were repressed and forbidden. A central belief at the time was that all had to be vigilant against the devil and his influence. As tensions rose in the community, individuals began accusing others of being witches who had made pacts with the devil. These accusations were often based on little to no concrete evidence, but were driven by fear, suspicion, and social conflict. Accused witches became symbols of the dark, repressed desires and behaviors of the community. By projecting these undesirable qualities onto others, the community attempted to distance itself from them. This resulted in numerous unjust trials and executions, and is forever remembered as the Salem witch trials. So how could something so awful occur? What was taking place psychologically in Salem during the 17th century? Well, this is a classic example of the Jungian concept of shadow projection, which is the second cause we will be exploring of why there is less and less room for redemption in our culture. So what is the shadow archetype? Well, Carl Jung described it as the parts of one's personality that have either been rejected and disallowed by a person's environment or even themselves. This forces it into the unconscious underbelly of the individual. Now, it's typical that people project their shadow onto others, and it's understandable why. If there is a part of your personality that is terrifying or unacceptable to you, it doesn't just disappear because you don't want it. It simply lurks beneath the surface of consciousness, which means it hasn't been integrated into your conscious personality. Therefore, it is far easier to identify it in other people. In fact, you're more likely to identify it in others. And this is why. The shadow presses itself upon the conscious self, demanding acknowledgement. It's knocking on the door of consciousness, but hasn't yet been accepted. So it's essentially floating around as a rogue piece of you looking for a home. If you can't accept it as part of yourself, it has to go somewhere. Therefore, one can quickly grant it a home, and the person opposite them, who they believe demonstrates this unacceptable trait. What's so troubling about shadow projection is that if one identifies their own unacceptable quality in another, then they turn the other person into a villain. So why do they turn them into a villain? Well, imagine being haunted by a terrible quality within yourself that you haven't yet accepted as part of you. It's constant background disturbance chipping away at you. Naturally, if the person can't accept it as a part of themselves, then they want it gone forever. So what do you think happens when this intolerable quality lurking in the periphery of their consciousness presents itself in someone else? They can finally identify it outside of themselves. So now this unacceptable quality that they want banished forever has become personified in the form of this other person, a perfect villain. If they can destroy them, then they can separate themselves from this unacceptable quality and be free of it. But of course, this isn't the case. In fact, the longer one represses and projects their shadow, the bigger the shadow gets, demanding acknowledgement and integration, until eventually it's all they can see and the entire world becomes the face of their shadow. In fact, the longer one represses their shadow, the more likely they are to act it out in the world. The Salem witch trials exemplifies this perfectly. The people were deeply afraid of the devil, and saw him as the embodiment of evil and were terrified of his influence. And yet in their attempt to hold this evil at bay, they committed some of the most evil acts imaginable. They became the very shadow they refused to accept. So does this start to explain the lack of redemption in our culture? In the first video, we looked at the projection of the hero archetype, which leads to a lack of nuance and an extreme perspective of people being all good or all bad. This in turn leads to the repression of flaws and negative traits in the face of moral perfectionism. Imagine this on mass scale. Imagine an entire society of people believing that there is no place for or acceptance of their flaws and imperfections. Where do these unwanted qualities go? They get banished into the depths of their unconscious, deepening the size and intensity of their shadow. Now imagine we give that entire society the most access to one another in the history of mankind through the form of social media, and what do you have? You have an entire nation of people who have no place to honestly express their own flaws and mistakes, but an endless supply of people they don't know who they can project these unacceptable qualities onto. In short, you have an ever-enlarging shadow with an ever-enlarging supply of people to project it onto. So where do we go from here? Well, Carl Jung stated that we have to withdraw our projections. I believe this could be the pathway back to redemption, which we will explore in part 3.